Hebrews is written to Messianic Jews who are being persecuted and are considering abandoning the faith altogether and returning to Judaism. And in chapters 1 through 10, the preacher is going to say, Jesus is so much better. You have everything to gain if you continue to follow him, but you have everything to lose if you turn your back on him. Then in chapter 11, he's going to transition to a call to persevere through suffering. Now, the preacher, he has reason to believe that their persecution is about to get much worse. In chapter 10, we learn that these Messianic Jews have been publicly reproached. Their property has been stolen. Some of them have been put in prison, but no one's died yet. In chapter 12, verse 4, it says, "In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted yet to the point of shedding your own blood." He says, not yet. It seems that that may soon change. In chapter 10, verse 36, he says, "For you have need of endurance." Now, all of this discussion of persecution and suffering, it sets up the amazing Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, which is actually an exposition of Habakkuk chapter 2. Did you know that? Take a look at this. Here's Hebrews chapter 11, the amazing chapter, but right before it is this little quotation from Habakkuk chapter 2. He says, "You have need of endurance," and then he quotes these words from Habakkuk, saying, God says to the prophet that the destroyer, he is coming, but my righteous one, he will live by faith. He will trust me. And if he shrinks back, I will take no pleasure in him. And now we have this warning section here, which we're very familiar with by this time in Hebrews. Those who shrink back, we are not like those who shrink back and destroyed, but we are like those who have faith. And then, of course, we're going to be given a long portrait of what that faith looks like. Faith in the midst of hardship. And this section is going to begin with a critical definition of that faith. Faith, you guys probably have this verse memorized, is the assurance of things hoped for and the convictions of things not seen. And if you keep reading the chapter, things not yet received. And then we're just going to get this long list of people in the Old Testament who exemplified this kind of faith. Noah, he went out and he built a boat, even though he didn't see a single rain cloud in the sky. Abraham, he didn't see the land that he was called to go to, nor did he receive that land in his lifetime, but he had faith. Others were tortured, flogged, stoned, killed, of whom the world is not worthy, the preacher will exalt. And what's the takeaway from this section? Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, people who exemplify faith in the midst of life that's just not going right, let us run our race with endurance. And this word endurance, it is linked with suffering and persecution, because in the very next verse, it's going to say that Jesus endured the cross. And he, Jesus, is the ultimate example of this kind of faith. But more than an example, he's the founder of that faith. He placed that faith in our chest, and he's the perfecter of it as well. And that is where our confidence to hold fast comes from. Jesus is perfecting that faith in us. Well, in chapter 11, the preacher defined faith. Now here at the beginning of chapter 12, he will redefine suffering. He will redefine that suffering as discipline. He wants you to see that your suffering and persecution is discipline from the Lord, and it is proof that God truly loves you. And now he's going to be preaching on Proverbs chapter 3, where we're taught that fathers who love their sons discipline them. And the question exemplified in this warning is, how will you respond to the father's discipline? Well, the preacher tells you how to respond. Let me show you. He says in 12:12, let's see, we're in chapter 11. Let's go down to 12. He says, this is how you should respond to your father's discipline. You should lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees. Make straight paths for your feet. Do not grow weary or faint-hearted, for God will work in you if you will let him. Now, in this next section, this comparison of Sinai and Zion, the preacher is going to call on his audience to remember the source of the covenant that they're tempted to return to. Where did that covenant, the Mosaic covenant, come from? It came from Sinai. And what's Sinai like? Well, he's going to tell them in no uncertain terms. This is what Sinai is like. Sinai, it is a blazing fire, darkness, gloom, a tempest, the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words may the hearers beg to hear no more. But that's not the mountain that we have come to. No, we've come to a different mountain altogether. We have come to Mount Zion. And what characterizes Mount Zion? Well, it's a party. Mount Zion is the city of the living God, where innumerable angels gather together in a festal gathering, and the assembly of the firstborn are enrolled in heaven. Jesus himself, that is our mountain and our covenant. It is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And that's going to lead us to our final warning of the whole book of Hebrews. He's going to say, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking to you. And speaking to you from where? Jesus speaks from heaven, issuing that warning. Follow me and live. And he's going to make the same comparison he's made before. If they did not escape the warning that was issued from earth, the curses of the Mosaic covenant, if they did not escape those curses, so you will not escape the word that is issued from heaven. And the preacher can't resist one final comparison between the old covenant and the new covenant. And we're going to see that here in our last chapter, Hebrews 13. Now, under the old covenant, the Levitical priests, they would consume the sacrifices. They would eat the sacrificial meat. And we, as members of the new covenant, we fellowship with Jesus himself, our Messiah, at the Lord's Supper, communion. And members of the old covenant who refuse to follow their Messiah, they have no right to eat at that altar and be strengthened by grace. Well, those sacrificial animals, their bodies, once consumed, they were burnt outside of the camp. In the same way, Jesus suffered outside the city of Jerusalem. And the preacher is going to call on his audience of Messianic Jews. He's going to call on them to go to Jesus outside the camp and bear reproach with him. For Jesus, he bore that reproach for the joy that was set before him. And therefore, he was exalted to the right hand of God, where he now intercedes for us as our great high priest, the great high priest of the new covenant, which secures for us our eternal redemption. Are we going to turn away from that? No, let us rather run the race that is set before us with endurance.